we'll get it going.
Okay.
So I'd like to welcome everybody to the latest edition of Inside the Doctor's Lounge, a place where we can all come together and have honest and frank discussion, kind of like what happens inside a real doctor's lounge. Never know what goes on behind the doors there. And, a doctor's lounge really is a place that is a safe place for doctors to have such discussions, whether it's about patient care and or any other topic really without any kind of fear of repercussion. And that's so important, especially in times like this. And with that, we are really honored to have a special guest today, Janet Smith Meeks, incredibly accomplished person in general, but we're going to get into her background too. She's an author. She is really the embodiment of the gracious leader. And so we're going to get into that. But, one of the topics that we've had discussions with over time internally has been the role of administrators and how the worlds often collide between physicians and administrators. I know in my own hospital, I saw the number of administrators kind of gradually increase over time. And I've got my own little stories to tell, and I know my colleagues all have their stories. With that, I'd like to introduce my colleagues. I have Rhonda Crow, our CEO and founder of MD Coaches, Dr. Randy Cook, who hosts an outstanding podcast that we have produced. It's called Prescription for Success, or RX for Success, however you want to call it, but it's so many fantastic episodes there. And Dr. Rick Zollinger, our bud from Charlotte, North Carolina, by way of Columbus, Ohio. And again, Janet Meeks is with us today, and her background is really incredible. So I don't want to do all the talking here. I do want to get right into not only welcoming you, Janet, but, let's get it going. Rhonda, you were talking just before we started, our little subtitle today is When the Worlds Collide Between Physicians and Administrators. I like to say, can't we all get along? But so I know we all have our stories to tell. And Janet, I'm going to kind of let you kind of explain maybe your perspective as an administrator to get started. And then, I'd like to kind of share our stories as well. The three of us have all been on that physician side for a long time, and Rhonda's been kind of on both sides as well. But your perspective, as an administrator, first as a banker of all things, and I come from, my family was full of bankers. Have you noticed in your career, as you were working full time as an administrator, had you noticed some of the pushback? Or do you have a specific story that you can tell of some of that frustration that physicians feel? Because quite honestly, many of us have we feel like commodities. So I'll let you kind of take that.
Hey, thank you for having me today. It's a joy to be among friends here, and I appreciate the opportunity just for us to have lively conversation about this really important topic. I think that yes, the struggle is real. And I think in part it's, and I'm going to speak from an administrator's perspective, I think in part it's how we have been trained. So physicians are trained in the science, and they focus solely on the good and well-being of the patient, and have not, unless they are a physician who also has an MBA, they really don't have that perspective regarding the business fundamentals that are required in order to keep a business not only running, but to sustain it and to keep it healthy so you can continue to invest in capital equipment and so forth. From my view and my own experience, how you are trained is not only about what goes on in the formal classroom of academia, it's also what you learned from those whom you followed. And over the course of my 40 years in healthcare, I would tell you I've worked with the very best as far as a role model administrator who worked beautifully with physicians. And I also had an opportunity to work with what I consider to be among the worst. And I'll give you an example. I will share the name of the one that was the best, Dan Wilford, who was my first healthcare CEO, And I only had the good fortune of working with him for about a year because he was recruited away to Memorial Hermann Healthcare System. It was Memorial, and then he was there to affect the merger of the two organizations, and he retired several years ago as a president emeritus. So he was obviously revered there, and he certainly was when I worked for him and with him at North Mississippi Medical Center in Tupelo, Mississippi. When the man left our organization, the medical staff gave him a Rolex watch. He and I was not, in my short time there, and I was really just spending my focus on learning healthcare and learning about the organization, but he had this beautiful blend of confidence and humility. And I think that's oftentimes what is missing in order to optimize the physician-administrator relationship. Is the administrators need to be secure enough that they can be humble. And I'll expand upon that in just a minute. Now, a quick note on the administrator whom I consider to be among the worst that I worked with. I will not share the name, but I will tell you that this person's view of physicians, and just like yesterday, I can recall him referring to physicians as greedy bastards. And that was just the way he led, and he ultimately lost his job. So that's volumes.
Couldn't happen to a nicer guy, sounds like.
I know. I learned some good. Go ahead.
And I was just going to say, the irony of that statement is, that is often a perception of not just administrators, but of the public in general. And it's when you become a physician yourself and you start to realize the personalities of the majority of your colleagues are anything but. These are some of the most dedicated people with true empathy. And like you just said, humility. These are all leaders in their own right, whether they're obvious leaders or not. What the responsibilities they take on and the things that they do quietly without anyone noticing is just, it's staggering. Yet to have that kind of attitude towards the people that are basically providing you the position that you're in, and to have that type of adversarial attitude is really, it's really quite disappointing. But I suspect that there are more of those out there.
Unfortunately, that is the case. And from my perspective, as I'm always on a continuous learning journey, I've had the good fortune of most of the time learning from people who taught me the right way to lead, but there were some examples who taught me how not to lead, and that was one of them. So yes, the struggle is real, although maybe I'm a little bit Pollyanna, but throughout my career, I have not had personally many struggles with physicians. And I think there's several reasons for that. And so I'd just like to talk for a moment about why I think the struggle exists, and that there are several failures that contribute to the struggle that administrators need to own. First of all, the failure of having the proper perspective. I learned my first day in healthcare administration in 1983 that as much as an administrator might like to admit a patient, we don't have that privilege, and we don't get to fulfill that very important role. Administrators don't admit, doctors do. And so I think sometimes administrators forget that the only reason that the patients are in our hospitals and our facilities is because physicians wrote an order and told them to go to that particular facility.
That's right.
I think there's a failure on the part of administrators to seek feedback from physicians, asking them to tell us what's broken. And therein is where administrators really need to be secure. My view, and I talk about this in Gracious Leadership, is that we need to see problems as opportunities, because as leaders, we can only fix what's broken if we know about it.
That's right.
So I made it my practice to constantly ask doctors, hey, tell me what's broken. What can we do better? And it, frankly, in the beginning, when I first went to St. Anne's, I think it caught some people off guard because it's, you want to know what's broken? I said, absolutely, please tell me what's broken. Because, you know, I think at the end of the day, we all want to do the right thing to take great care of patients. But if administrators stick their heads in the sand and fail to look for that continuous opportunity to improve, and more specifically to understand that it is the physician and the nurses who are closest to the patients, and therefore they have the best perspective about what needs to be improved.
That also speaks to a problem-solving mentality that most
Mhm.
physicians and medical people have. We
Mhm.
share that. We're constantly solving problems. We have to use critical thinking. And
Yeah.
I'm just imagining if you had been an administrator in a hospital I was working in and you came and approached me, I'd be so appreciative of you doing that. And especially if there was some sincerity and some follow-up action with it, because over the years I heard a lot of lip service too, and that becomes exceptionally frustrating, I should say.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more to that point. The next failure is the failure to honor the feedback.
Mhm.
And, I made it my practice to tell physicians early on that I would always seek and welcome their feedback, but for them to please understand that I might not be able to do everything that they ask, but that if I could not do what they ask, I promised that I would always tell them why. Um, and then another thing that I discovered, this was a little bit shocking, but I think that as administrators, we fail to not only follow through, but to tell the physicians that we followed through.
Mhm.
A real experience, I had a surgeon approach me about a problem. Actually, I was walking down the hall and say, "Hey, how's it going? Anything we can do better?" And he gave me an example of an opportunity for improvement. And I went straight to my office, called the respective leader within the Department of Surgery, said, "Hey, Dr. Smith has told me about X, Y, and Z. Would you please take care of it?" "Absolutely, Janet, I'll do it." Well, I run into Dr. Smith a couple of weeks later in the hall and say, "Hey, did we get that taken care of for you?" He said, "No." And I was just taken aback. And I said, "I'm so sorry. I'll follow up immediately." I called the person in surgery. I said, "What happened?" Dr. Smith said, "You didn't fix the problem." And she said, "Janet, I fixed it the very day you called me." I said, "Well, did you tell him that you fixed it?" And she said, "No."
A
So,
failure
I
to
mean,
communicate.
as simple as it sounds, just the taking that little step, and it's about showing respect to the physician who cared enough. You asked for an opportunity for improvement. He told me, we fixed it, but we didn't tell him. So I think that they're part of the struggle is oftentimes just the absence of the little things that can make a profound difference in the relationship.
I would agree with that. And communication is always right there at the top, just keeping that open line and being there too. Showing that you care. We had an administrator, we had in my career at one hospital in particular, gotten to know many administrators, but one of our guys, our CEO of our hospital, I'd see him delivering newspapers at 7 a.m, talking to the patients. And that made an impression on me versus some others who can never find them. They're never there. They're never visible. And that hurts morale. So,
Well,
yeah.
you're right. One of the most valuable experiences I had, and this falls under the bucket of communications, which, by the way, Des, was one of my next failures, is the failure to communicate sincerely and systematically. But one of my greatest experiences was shadowing physicians, be it hospitalists, be it, putting on scrubs and going into surgery, or I shadowed emergency department physicians on the third shift. But just being able to go there and be with them and to care enough to show them that you want to see what they're experiencing in a real life situation.
I bet you had guys or physicians wanting to teach you things too. In the process, it just starts to happen that way. It organically just turns into this. Basically, you're garnering huge respect just by doing that simple act. It's showing that you're actually sincerely interested in what they're doing and trying to understand. That goes so far. That would be a huge little thing, and that's leadership by example too. That's not talking about it.
Janet, I would the key word I would mention is transparency. So in my career, which I came out of training in '85, so I got, and on the business side, you said, well, we were trained differently. Well, I started a 5-man group. We had multi-million dollars. I did the budget. Yeah, so I understood the business. So when the hospitals transparently would come to us administratively and say in the 90s and that, well, we need to cut costs. We need, the nurse planner and discharge, where they got me to get rid of hearts in 3 days and stuff. But they would never tell me. We said, well, what are your costs? What do you need to cut? Well, we can't tell you the difference between costs and charges. They would never tell us what real dollars were. They wouldn't team with you. And then the other question I have, or statement, I guess, is within a system like you were in, we were thrown into competing between downtown Maine, Westerville, you're competing with Ohio Health, Ohio State. So that was thrown up in our faces. Well, we're not as good as across the street, or we're better, or we need to cut costs in this respect. And I don't know how it's evolved now as we've gone through this whole process of the hospital administrators running it, now that the physicians are owned by a lot of hospital systems. Maybe there's a better collaboration now, is there? I mean, that would be what I would hope.
Well, now, in the spirit of transparency, I retired from my full-time role as a hospital president 5 years ago. And, we were under incredible pressure to deliver an extraordinarily healthy bottom line. So, I can't speak to why they weren't willing to share the cost, or where they felt like there was excess that needed to be cut. I can just tell you, my view was I always believed you can't cut your way into prosperity, and had a growth mentality with just the drive to try to recruit more physicians to come and join our family. That could be tricky if they happen to compete with an existing group. But I think I was very fortunate to have a med exec and a medical staff that understood that we're all going to be stronger together, working together, than we are if we're apart.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Des, I'd like to slip a question in here that
Yes.
I think, at least for me, is very important in this discussion about controlling costs, and why maybe hospital administrators are perhaps not as transparent as they might be. And that is, over the period of time from just slightly before when I started to practice to today, the number of administrators in healthcare or in hospital administration has outpaced physicians by a factor of 3,200 to 1. So I personally have, and I've served on a hospital board for quite a number of years, and I've never had a CEO come to the meeting and say, you know what, we're going to have to eliminate some of our administrative staff. That's never happened. I'm just not going to say any more and let you talk about that if you can.
Well, without mentioning the name of a system, I'm aware of 2 very high-ranking executives, both of whom performed very well, whose positions were recently eliminated from the healthcare system. And I think in part that is a function of the economics of COVID and how that has affected hospitals, particularly with the reprieve on elective cases that were set aside, appropriately so, for a significant amount of time. But your point is just astounding, Randy, the ratio of administrators to physicians being added in healthcare. As I think about that, I'm not surprised because, yes, big complex organizations get heavily burdened with the cost of too many administrators. So I think the pendulum via COVID is going to swing, and you're probably going to see fewer administrators now with a broader span of control and having to do more. One thing I would like to point out, my view and my experience, is that when the focus is on quality and safety, then if you're delivering a high quality, safe service or product, if you will, to patients, then it's not likely going to be as expensive. The better safety, better quality should correlate with lower cost.
You would think.
I mean, that's been my experience. And thankfully, as I left St. Anne's, we were leapfrog grade A for several years, and they continue now. They arrived at them and are staying in the top 5% of hospitals nationally. So I can't speak to how they do internationally now.
I'll tell you a quick story, and then I'll just kind of throw this out there. A few years ago, I was in a general staff meeting, and the guys, I've told the story before, but it was a general staff meeting, our biannual meeting, and everybody's there, have a dinner, get together, and everybody's, typical catching up with each other. And they brought in people from corporate. Not once during that entire meeting did they ever mention patient care. And I looked around the room, and every head of every physician in that room was down, whether looking at their phones or just ignoring, just not hearing the message. To me, that was a real important moment for me, because that kind of encapsulated everything that's going on, where we feel like we are commodities again. We feel like the administration is not hearing us. We're here to be worker bees, to somehow support somebody's bottom line. And I guess my point is, can you recall at some point, when did this all start to shift, would you say? Can you kind of focus in on what incident or what episode or whatever it was, whether it's the genesis of HMOs and all this stuff? I'm trying to pinpoint, because administrators and physicians generally, when I was starting out, we all pretty well got along. We're all working, like you're saying, working towards the same goals. And it's somewhere along that it started to become adversarial. We were just, you have to produce your RVUs and this and that, especially the docs who were employed now by the hospital system or the hospital itself, guys who'd given up their private practices. Again, long-winded question, maybe it wasn't direct, but can you kind of pinpoint, when did things start to change?
Well, you may have already answered that question, Des, because I think that the phenomenon of employed physicians has really contributed to the view or the perspective that doctors are commodities, and it makes my heart hurt just to say that. I mean, it really does. And because I think that if you break the spirit of a physician who has been in private practice and so proud of that practice, and then you put them into an employment model and treat them like, I hate the words lower level, but I'm going to use that, lower level worker bee, then that's what you're going to get. And,
well, we unfortunately have created a perfect economic storm that almost couldn't lead to anything other than that. And that is, physicians graduate from their training with a level of debt that is just unimaginable to me. They can't really afford to invest in their own business. And then we have not hospitals, but hospital systems and HMOs and the alphabet soup of organizations that need people to provide the service. And it puts the physicians into the position of being employee. And poor Rhonda has heard me say this about a gazillion times. The moment a physician is employed by anybody other than the patient's going to lose, in my opinion.
Yeah. Actually, if I'll marry on to that today, on Randy's podcast, as a matter of fact, we recently had an interview with a young physician, Dr. Leah Houston, and that's not a plug, although I would say, yeah, please go listen to the interview. But Janet, being a guest on our podcast, one of the things that we do is we take quotes from our interview and we share that with folks on social media, and we're part of some physician groups. And I'll tell you, the one that we posted today was on that topic, that very topic. She made a quote that it's a conflict of interest, that physicians take a Hippocratic oath, and to be employed, you can't serve two masters, basically, is what she was saying.
Well stated.
And physicians have to make a choice. They need to take care of the patient, or they need to take care of the business. That's really kind of where they've been placed. And they face that struggle every day just to go do what it is that they had a heartfelt desire to do, and why they went into this profession was to take care of patients. But now even that's tainted because of the structure that they have to walk into. So this posting that we did today, my phone has not stopped pinging. It is getting response because that hit a nerve. This is a conflict of interest. That phrase, I can tell you, that's what hit the nerve.
You know, Rhonda, the first job I ever had out of when I graduated residency, I came down to Jacksonville, and I was hired by a group, and they were going to try and make this national company. And within several months, they were starting to get on my case about number of surgeries I was performing or wasn't performing, or, you know, and it was almost like after you start hearing the cash register going off in your head every time you're with a patient. And when I finally moved on to my own practice, I had to break that mindset, because that's not why I went into medicine. And it was so frustrating. I finally said, you know what? Enough of this. I don't care I don't want to know what procedures cost. I don't want to know. I just have to do the right thing. And when I did that, I was so much happier.
I bet.
I was back to being myself.
Yeah.
You know, the other interesting thing that went along with that is that simultaneously with that very movement, they put another set of shackles on us called the electronic medical record, which is nothing but a cash register.
Well, that's for sure, Randy. That, you know, unfortunately, we could talk all day about that.
Randy, my eyes still twitch from time to time from all the stress I felt when we converted to the electronic.
Bet you did.
Horrible.
I'm just getting over the Tourette's here.
let me take a different tack. Yeah, this is something that's happening here, and I think it's kind of interesting. And you would tell me about Columbus, especially with OSU and stuff, but in North Carolina, it's just happening right as we speak during this year with COVID and everything. There's being a consolidation of the university medical centers are merging into the private. So OSU and Riverside are merging. University of Cincinnati and Mount Carmel are merging to cover the South. So in North Carolina, there's basically now two major healthcare systems. And one's aligned with Wake Forest, one's aligned with UNC. And part of that, when we're talking about costs, is because the university healthcare systems cover such a large portion of the Medicaid population. And they're the safety net in the states, and they're going broke. At least ours is, Chapel Hill is. And so they're consolidating with the private systems. And all of that is what we were just talking about. You're talking about middle level of management of administrations. There's going to be, they're going towards this cost cutting, but the tying in with academics, for me, if I was younger, would be wonderful to have, you know, if I was in Westerville, to align with, have the things that the university would bring. Might be cool. I don't know. If I was administrator now, I think that might be fun, but that's a big deal in our state.
You just took me back to 1995 to 2002 when I worked at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And part of my job there, this is on a much smaller scale than what you're talking about, the mergers of these major organizations, but part of my role was to create mechanisms through which we could have formal alignment between the academic center and community physicians. And you talk about culture clash. There was, you know, because you're not a real doctor unless you're also teaching and doing research. But then the people who were clinicians, you know, seeing tons of patients and doing a fabulous job, felt disrespected by that, the proverbial town and gown. Right? But we were able to assimilate several practices into our organization. And I'll use one example because I think it gets back a little bit to what you were talking about with this phenomenon of treating physicians like commodities. We had worked with, in this case, it was pediatric practice because Vanderbilt had this big children's hospital. And we did not buy their practice back then. I won't bore you with the details. We had a model where they contributed the practice and we contributed money, and then we co-led the practice. And I'll never forget the doctors wanted to grow the practice. They needed to expand the building. And they asked me, well, don't we need to call the Vanderbilt architects? And as much as I revered the Vanderbilt architects, I said, no, don't do that. I said, you do what you would do if you were in your private practice and bring in and make this work. And you can do it more cost effectively than we ever could. And they expanded this building. And I think they spent $60,000. And it would have cost 5 times that if we had done it,
Oh, yeah.
with the bureaucracy.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah.
And if I got my hand slapped, I forgot about it. I don't think I did. Probably wouldn't have mattered. But the point is, we just did our best to, even though they were, in this case, I think those doctors actually were employed by us, but we did not treat them like that. We continued to treat them as partners. So I guess that's part of the struggle. You do have this new breed of young physicians coming out of medical school who want to work 8 to 5
Yeah.
and
Oh,
get
yes.
paid the
Mhm.
same salaries that the physicians who are working, many, many more hours. And so there's a little reality check that you have to have there as well.
All the more reason for them to be in business for themselves.
Right.
There's nothing like being in business for yourself that will
That's
teach you
right. Yeah.
so many things you need to know about the world.
Mhm.
Well, and to that point, as I was thinking about our conversation today, I just think the whole issue with conflicting economic interest is a great contributor to the struggle between administrators and hospitals. And I'll use an example. Let's just say we had recruited a couple of orthopedic surgeons and spent several $1,000,000 to provide what they needed and to bring their patients to our facility. And we were delighted to have them, absolutely critical. And then they decided to open their ASC, and now they're doing hips and knees in an outpatient setting. And so that can contribute, I think, to some ill feelings, but it's just the nature of the beast. And I think administrators have to get real that that's physicians who have their private practice are going to and have every right to optimize their revenue in the setting that is, in their opinions, best for their patients and best for them economically.
Absolutely. Nothing stays the same. You have to try and stay 2 steps ahead at least. Otherwise, you're going to get left behind before you know it.
And I'm going to have to point out one other thing here, and that is we really do need to figure out some way to make sure the government is responsible when they enter this conversation, because the very thing that you were talking about, Janet, back in the early part of the 21st century was that period when the government funding of healthcare began to encourage physicians to become more competitive with hospitals. Start your outpatient surgery center, start your outpatient endoscopy center. And now that's kind of coming back to bite them, because the hospital started having a hard time staying afloat, and it created a bitter discussion between hospitals and physicians at the very time when they needed to be getting along as well as they possibly could. They couldn't find any common ground. So the politicians have had their opportunity to mess it up, and they did. And so I think that's something that people need to be very careful of when they start voting, and that is what their politicians are actually doing for them.
The one I would use and throw out as a specialty that was the canary in the coal mine was plastic surgeons. And I would tell you, Janet, this one's been my pet peeve since 2005 when I started doing wound care. So I'm in a metropolitan area of 2 million people, and we have no access to plastic surgery in a reconstructive mode unless I send the patient to Wake Forest.
Wow.
So that would be like I'm in Columbus and I say, I'm sending the patient to Cincinnati because there's no plastic surgeon on staff. And the plastic surgeons that are on staff do exactly what you just said. At 5 o'clock, I'm out of here. So they don't do any reconstruction. They just carry them on and on. And that to me is one of the specialties that I would love to see somehow that changed. And the only way I see that change is that the hospitals will come back and say, okay, we employ plastic surgery and we pay them very well instead of doing breast augmentation. And maybe they'll come back and we can set a standard for that in our hospital, because none of these hospitals have that. Not Ohio State doesn't have it, I guarantee you. They just don't. And so I've always thought plastic surgery was the eye opener for going to the surgery centers. They were the first ones that said, okay, we're out of here.
Absolutely.
We're not taking ER call. We're not doing anything. We're gone.
Well, they were the second ones. The ophthalmologist went first.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Ophthalmology went, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I've seen it in GI.
Yeah.
I've seen it in ortho.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
So,
Well, it's like it's like the old call of the doctor's office. Your call's important to us. Call 911.
Right.
That's correct.
And,
yeah,
and, we,
I love it.
and every one of us knows we push 0.
That's right.
Right? We push 0. 0.
I want to talk to a person.
Give me to a person.
And I'm going to bet, Rick, that you were probably in your wound care experience as I was. I gave all my patients my cell phone number.
Yeah, they could get a hold of me because they couldn't find
Because if
it.
they go through the answering service, they could go for days and not find you.
You know, Randy, and it's less stressful for all involved. It's
Oh,
like
man.
you don't want to see your patient
get
get
to
into
fix it.
trouble.
Yeah.
And or have a surprise when you see them, at their
Mhm.
next appointment. It's just so much better that way. I did the same thing, and people never abuse that either.
It was astounding how few calls I got.
Wound care-
Exactly.
Wound care was different in that we would see the patients every week, Janet, and so that was an evolution for all of us that you really started to take ownership, even over a family practitioner who saw you. I'll see you back in 6 weeks, see how your foot's doing. We'd actually see people every week. The only process I'd have with that is when the EMR came out. Wound care doesn't lend itself to being dealt with. This is off tangent, but being dealt with as on production, because you do what's right. And I found in my practice at the end, there was a couple young surgeons, they were just debriding everybody for this. And it graded me no ends. And that's kind of what led me out the door.
No, I think it's coincidentally that, the three of us and Rhonda, we've all been in the wound care world before, and there's certain commonality there too. And I think it speaks to that satisfaction that we all had, putting all the business mess and all the other things aside. We got to spend time with our patients. We got to know them, and we got to see results, and we know we're making a difference. It's not glamorous, but we all were doing what we really set out to do when we first became physicians or aspired to be docs.
It sure was glamorous to those people that were coming in to get their sores taken care of.
That's right. That's right.
Absolutely.
Well, the one thing that made wound care, and we'll go back to our subject. Sorry, Ron.
No,
The one thing
It's the
I found,
lounge, man.
and maybe this is a good thing, Janet, because what wound care did do is if you go to a national wound care meeting, you would have a ball, because at the meeting, there are nurses, there are physical therapists, there are surgeons, there are administrators, there are infectious disease hospitalists. They all come together to one meeting for wound care.
Yeah.
And it was I hadn't done that in 30 years. You'd go to a wound care meeting and you actually had the camaraderie again between all staff.
Yeah.
And it might be a good learning process for people to just go to one to see the interaction of that.
That's why we go too.
That's why you've touched on two things that I think have a common theme. One, Rick, is the camaraderie from going to those meetings where you've got people with different backgrounds but focused on a common goal.
Yes.
And then from the perspective of you as physicians seeing your wound care patients every week, that fostered a beautiful relationship that you had with your patients and them with you. And at the end of the day, I really think that it is that camaraderie and that relationship that are missing between the administrators and the physicians.
You know, Janet, you have
Great.
beautifully laid a foundation here for a couple of thoughts that I've been having during this conversation. And that is physicians are starting to find their voice, and it's becoming much more amplified in that there is a strong desire to get back to the sanctity of the patient-physician relationship. And how do I create that? How do I build that in a business model? And I do think that's really the trigger for why we're starting to see more direct primary care practices that are popping up. And we're now starting, I know Randy and I have talked to a few physicians that are even going into specialty areas that are direct care. So they're cutting out all of this middle stuff and getting back to this one-on-one. And I think what you've talked about is really it's spawning that. It's there's this thirst, this hunger to get back to that, so that there is pride in the work that they do. They're reinstilling that within that relationship. And, you know, another thought that I had too during this conversation, we've talked about, the challenge that physicians are having, but I think there are administrators, and especially those that are in the middle management area, that have to walk a line. They have to walk a line between it is a business, and we want to be profitable so that we can provide the mission that we're here for. But I am empathic, and I am respectful, and I do want to work collegially with my physicians. How do I walk that line? How do I, where's my playbook? And, that's one of the things I really enjoy about the work that you have done. You have, you've laid out a lovely, I'm just going to call it the playbook for leadership, and how you do walk that line. And make no mistake, it's not an easy one to walk, but I'd like for you to talk a little bit about that. If you would, please. I'm just going to go right here and tell you, I'm so proud to have this in my library. I wish I had it sooner in my career. And if y'all haven't seen it, it's Gracious Leadership by Janet Smith Meeks. She took all of these years of experience and these lessons that she's sharing with us today and put it in a lovely recipe book on how to build those relationships. So I'm going to be quiet for a minute now that I've kind of teed you up. I'd love for you to talk about it a little bit.
It's brilliant.
And I just want to know, Janet, if can a gracious leader, are they born that way, or is it something that is
great question.
With a lot of inherent type of personality traits, or is it something that even that one of those people that you referred to earlier who thought docs were just a bunch of greedy SOBs, can somebody like that be molded into a gracious leader?
I'm going to jump in here because I read the book, and I'm going to say that Janet is probably going to say that no, gracious leaders are not born, but they have good parents.
To start.
Well said, Randy. Des, the administrator I mentioned earlier is being an example of how not to lead, particularly in his perspective regarding doctors, thinking of them as greedy bastards. That person's not mentioned in my book. I should just tell you that. Can somebody learn this? I think that the answer is possibly yes, but you've got to have a very strong will to change. If somebody's a bully, or if they don't understand or are not willing to apply the time and the discipline to learn what I refer to as the 13 key ingredients of gracious leadership until they become second nature, then no. So I think maybe some of those convictions or attributes may be a part of who we are, part of our DNA. And to Randy's point, I mean, in my case, my parents shaped and molded me from many perspectives, because I grew up in Mississippi as the daughter of a country lawyer who in 1964 was the person who, as the attorney for the school board, told the school board when the federal mandate was issued that the schools were to be integrated. He is the person who said, we have to do this. And we don't have time to go into any of the detail, but long story short, he became a target of the KKK, and they threatened his life and my mother, my brother, my lives. because my dad, and this is one of the lessons in gracious leadership, that you're courageous to do the right thing, even when it's not popular. And I think that as administrators, we find ourselves in that situation a lot, that if I have to go to a physician and tell that individual what I can't do, then that takes some courage to do that. As I said earlier, I'm always going to say why I can't do it, but I'd much rather you can't be conflict averse and be a successful administrator. You cannot fall prey to giving doctors this proverbial slow no and garner their respect. But the book, Rhonda, I was looking through the key ingredients of gracious leadership this morning, just thinking about our conversation, and so many of the chapters are relevant to trying to foster optimal relationships between administrators and doctors. Gracious leaders are respectful. We talked about that. They value relationships. They listen with purpose and respond with care. So there you go with the follow through. They see problems as opportunities. Randy, we talked about that, you can't fix what's broken unless you know about it. So go ask. And I have yet, as I would ask doctors, tell me what's broken, I bet 75% of the time they said, nope, we're good. We're good. But when I first went there, it was like going to a fire hydrant for a sip of water. In the case of St. Anne's, it's like, what do you need, surgeons? What one thing can we change to make your experience better here as you work here? And what can we change to make your patient's experience better? And I just the projectile list of simple things. They wanted basic equipment in the OR. They wanted staff trained so they could take great care of their patients. And then you have to have courage, because as an administrator, sometimes you got people on your bus that aren't going where you're going. And if they don't get with the program and understand that we are here to serve physicians and patients, we're here to serve. Physicians are customers and our partners. And if you don't get that, my philosophy is, you get a couple strikes, but then you're out. And so,
absolutely.
Rhonda, thanks for the shout out about gracious leadership. I wrote this book. I wish I had had something like this when I was a young aspiring leader. I just wanted to keep it simple and help people understand there's some basic things they can do. And be a respectful leader who also can guide your team to achieve excellence.
Yeah, and that's the beautiful thing about the book, is you did keep it it's so beautifully written, and it's very simple, and I find it's a resource, and I think it should be in everyone's library that goes into in any field. Honestly, we're talking about leadership in any field, but for our purpose, particularly in healthcare, I think for now, for any nurse that I talk with, or anybody that's going into their first positions, this is a gift. This is something I'll be handing to them that, keep this one close by. This one will help you.
Thank you. And I'm really excited to share that in Nashville, the Middle Tennessee chapter of the American College of Healthcare Executives has just launched a Physician Leadership Academy. And they've included gracious leadership within their curriculum. So I'm really excited.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that.
we have to cultivate leaders, because, I think a lot of younger people, especially, are probably afraid to step up and to tap into their potential as leaders. But so we have so many followers, and maybe the types of leaders that we see portrayed every day are not necessarily in the positive light. And so this can discourage people too. So the title and all the humility that it speaks to, we need to tap into these, let our young people know that they're an important resource moving forward, and we've got to lift them up.
Yeah.
Well, and to your point, there's the fact that when I wrote this book a couple of years ago, and this has continued, if not accelerated, there's so much of a national spotlight on bad leaders and what not to do. That's the reason I wrote the book, because I wanted to show a better way to lead.
Well, you certainly have. And Rhonda,
So-
please, again, I'm glad you're plugging this because this is so important.
Make
And
sure the light doesn't bounce off of it. So it's called Gracious, you need it this way, Gracious Leadership by Janet Smith Meeks. And Janet, where can people find it?
Two places. You can find it on Amazon. It's in hardback, Kindle, and an audiobook, or you can go to my website, which is www.graciousleadershipbook.com. And there's a free blog that I post probably once or twice a month. If people want to sign up to receive that ongoing email blog, just for hope, some nuggets of inspiration, maybe a little bit of wisdom, then that's the place to go.
The blog site is equally as informative as the book.
And I'll tell you, the bonus is that great caramel cake recipe you got in the back there.
Ooh.
So.
Now we're talking.
It's still hard.
It's hard, but it's
that's
good.
worth the purchase right there.
Yeah. Oh,
Well, listen, Janet, thank you so much for being part of this discussion today. Before we wrap up, I'm going to give my colleagues one chance to fire a quick question or comment. So Rhonda, again, ladies first.
Oh, thank you. I think two things. One, it is always keep in mind when you're exchanging with another person, regardless of what the circumstances are, always do so with respect. That's just the big one that I keep holding on to. And then the other piece would be do yourself a favor, go get the book.
Dr. Z.
Oh, I was just going to say, listen and go get the book.
All
That
right.
way.
Like minds.
The book's over here.
Randy.
I'll enlarge on that just a little bit to say I can't think of any point in the history of my medical career when we have been in greater need of gracious leadership than right now.
Yeah.
So get the book.
Great point. And Jan, I just want to say thank you for all you've done and continue to do. I just kind of like to wrap it up by saying, leadership is such an important concept, but back to your dad's example, he led with his heart. He was doing the right thing. And that's one of my favorite quotes was from Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, said, lead with your heart and the rest will follow.
That's right.
And that's what being a leader does, or what a leader is all about too, being empathetic, listening, and just doing the right thing, whether anybody's paying attention or not.
Hey, Dad, you do know that Norman Vincent Peale was from outside Columbus.
I did not know that. I read his biography or part of it years ago, but
Marysville.
Marysville, yeah.
Wow.
there's our obligatory plug for the state of Ohio.
Ohio is
it's
always
inevitable.
there somewhere, good and bad, always there.
Janet, I always have one of these in my pocket.
Oh,
A
Lord, here we
Buckeye.
go.
Oh, that's
There you go.
awesome.
Attaboy.
I can't find the right
Hi-yo.
part. There it is. Oh, whatever.
That's great.
Nice. Well, I've enjoyed this so much, and we'd love to have you back at some point too, Janet, because I'm sure we could talk about other topics. And
Oh, yeah.
can't thank you enough for being part of this, and for all of our viewers and anybody who participated today by listening or watching. Please continue to support what we're doing here. By all means, that red button that you see, hit that and subscribe to our channel. Go to MD Coaches or mymdcoaches.com. By all means, check out Randy's, again, excellent podcast, Prescription for Success. And until the next time that we're all together, remember that we see you, we believe in you, and we're here for you. Take care.
Thank you.
The struggle is real. That's the title of today's episode of Inside the Doctor's Lounge, where we examine what happens between hospital administrators and physicians and how our worlds collide, and yet how we all come together and try and solve problems that are unique, certainly during unique times. We're also fortunate to have an amazing guest today, Janet Smith Meeks. Her background is really quite incredible, and she not only was a hospital administrator for a number of years, but she's also written a book on leadership called The Gracious Leader. By all means, check it out. And by all means, please come back and be a regular member of Inside the Doctor's Lounge. All you've got to do is hit that red button on your screen and subscribe. We really enjoy what we do here, and we hope that you enjoy this too. By all means, check out mymdcoaches.com. Also, our colleague Randy Cook's exceptional podcast, Prescription for Success. Hope you enjoy what we're doing, like I said. And until next time, for Inside the Doctor's Lounge, I'm your host, Dr. Desmond Bell. Remember, we see you, we believe in you, and we're here for you.